afternoon, everyone. This is the March 14th meeting of the Land Development Team Oversight Subcommittee. And could I get a roll call, please?
Yes, we have Council Member Alejandro Gutierrez.
Here.
Council Member Mike Jordan.
Here.
And Chair Eric Friedman.
Here. So the first, on to preliminary matters. Are there any announcements, Mr. Isaacson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. We do have a few announcements we'd like to make, specifically in the area of staffing. So I'd like to provide a quick staffing update. We have several recently filled positions in community development, including we created and then filled the ombudsperson position, and that individual, Mark Aguilar, is sitting here to my left. We also then hired a new business analyst. That was an internal promotion. That position has been filled by Raven Rutledge, who's sitting in our audience today. Say hi to Raven. We've also hired an inspection supervisor. That individual is also sitting in the same row, Michael Rubin. Everyone, introduce yourselves to Michael. We've also hired 2 administrative specialists, an assistant planner and design review, a planning tech and design review, which was also an internal promotion, as well as a planning tech and zoning. The plan tech and zoning, which who will mostly be working the counters, is a Spanish-speaking employee, and so we really hope that that will further enhance our customer service to our Spanish-speaking population here in Santa Barbara. Next slide, please. We do still have several current vacancies as well as ongoing recruitments. The senior plan check engineer position, that one probably looks familiar. We've been trying to fill that position for over 2 years now, and have a very difficult time finding qualified applicants for that role. We also have a plans examiner position in building and safety, as well as a building inspector for mechanical and plumbing. We're also actively recruiting a residential plans examiner, building permit tech, as well as project planners in development review, and another planning tech in our zoning team. With that, that's all I have for announcements. I will turn it over to our ombudsperson, Mark Aguilar, for a quick update on some recent activity in our building and safety division.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to lead off here with our building code effectiveness grading schedule. It's really easy to say that. This is administered by Insurance Services Office, which is an independent group under Verisign, Verisk Analytics, thank you. And what they do is they evaluate local jurisdictions for their operations, their code admin, their plan review, field inspections, and certifications. And then they grade the performance of that jurisdiction.
I'm sorry, Mr. Can I stop you for just a second, because I think we got a little bit ahead on the agenda. There's a couple preliminary matters I needed to do. I think Mr. Isaac was doing the announcement. So before we get to you, I just we need to do the minutes and then general public comment before we get into the meat of the presentation. So first, was there any other thing with the agenda, Mr. Isaacson, that we need to change around?
No changes, Mr. Chair.
Perfect. And then we did have the minutes from the last meeting, and have we had a chance to look at those? And if so, is there a motion to approve the minutes, or are there any changes?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
A motion's been made by Member Gutierrez, second by Member Jordan. Any public comment on the minutes? Not seeing any. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Not hearing any opposed. Has unanimously. And then on to general public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to an item not on today's agenda but under the purview of this committee? Not seeing any public comment. I will close public comment. And now I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Aguilar. Thank you.
Thank you. Building and safety division efforts, recent. Building code effectiveness grading schedule, again, administered by Insurance Services, an independent group. They evaluate local jurisdictions, their code administration, plan review, training certifications, inspections, basically their operations. And then they grade them. A lower score is better. After this 5-month process, the city got rated a 3, which is a tremendous score. So we should be very happy about that. And what that lower score means is that we have well-enforced, up-to-date codes. This can be reflected in lower insurance rates within the community, and also a better chance to receive federal and state grants by that jurisdiction. And full transparency, we were prodded a little bit to complete this by Public Works because this would benefit that group as well.
If I could just jump in on that. So about a year ago, some teams in Public Works were looking at pursuing some grants from the State Office of Emergency Management for some capital upgrades to some of our facilities. We were unable to pursue those grant opportunities because we did not have a BCEGS rating at the time. And so it's just, I just want to make sure we acknowledge the tremendous effort of Tina Dye and her team to take this on, get us scored at a 3, and has now put the city in a much better position to pursue grant funds for large capital projects. And it's a very big deal, and it's just one example of a lot of the real hard work and dedication her team has done over the past year. So thank you for that.
Next, we have implemented, just this month, online building inspection requests. Citizens can now request building inspections directly through ACA. They no longer need to either email or phone. They can still do that for a short time, but we do have an intent to phase out those channels, phone and email, next month. We sent out public notifications to the Contractors Association, the AIA, and released an LDT bulletin. We crafted a step-by-step guide that's on our webpage to help folks along. We created a temporary email address so that customers can directly contact staff and get support on how to create an ACA account and learn how to schedule the inspections themselves. And then with many of the things that we've been doing recently, where we've gone to maybe a digital format, we still provide assistance for accessibility-related circumstances. We thought this was going to launch last fall. We had some issues, but we got it going. We have begun tracking unique users to see how quickly people are taking this up, and we have it's only been a week, and so I think I saw in a report today we had 14 or 15 unique users, but they are all different, and they're starting to use it daily. I guess additionally, we've also passed out some cards with QR codes to our inspectors who they can pass those along to the contractors that they meet with. Outdoor dining expansion on private property. This was something kind of directed by, well, I won't say like, it was directed by council. We implemented this in November. We've had roughly a dozen applications that have come in. Actually, we've had 14 to date. 2 of those were accidentally for parklets in the right-of-way. 4 of those have been reviewed and comments have been given back to those businesses. 6 are currently in review, and the other 2 applications right now are incomplete. So we're still working with those customers to get them back in. Certified Access Specialist training, we've been doing this in person and virtually. I think we started back in July. We've gone through a couple of sessions. We've included staff from other departments, including Public Works and Parks and Recreation. We have an accessibility forum for businesses and the public, similar to what we did last May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. But this time it'll be scheduled for June 27th. We completed something required by the state by a couple of bills. We're required to post online information for residential development, their fees, application requirements, maps, examples of real approved permit applications for certain housing types. We generally have all this information online, but it wasn't consolidated into one unique place. So we put that together. That was kind of a joint building and safety and planning effort. And we placed it on our project guidance webpage in advance of the January 1st deadline earlier this year. Also kind of a joint training, but it was primarily taken by the planning division, was something called Making It Pencil, the math behind residential development. This was about an hour training, if I recall. Really well done. It was by the Turner Center. There's a link there if you're interested in viewing it yourselves. But it covered a lot of processes on cap rates and what makes sense and what restrictions and policies can do to the cost of development. And this one I'm really proud of because I spent a lot of time on this, but this is our digital plan review, DigiPlan software. We're working with IT as the lead, and this affects most of the land development team. We kicked off in January a new software program that will go live in May. And the goals of the program, and I'll show you the next slide will show an image, but is to improve the customer experience, add a lot more efficiency to the plan review process, while also integrating directly into the Acela system so it doesn't confuse our customers. This is just one slide, a little hard to see, but what's new is like on the left side, you see thumbnail images of the plan sheets that come in. Before those plan sheets come in, the software will review the format of the files, whether those are acceptable, if there's passwords, it won't accept them. If there is misnumbering of pages, it will tell the customer before it takes the upload that, no, you need to adjust these. So it's going to save staff a lot of time there just on the intake. In the middle of the image, you kind of see like a little red square and some red text below that. What that allows us to do is we can have a library of comments for consistent comments, but which we can also customize on the fly. We can place messages on the plans, and then later on, if you click on that, it will take you straight from what you've circled to that comment. Additionally, what we're looking forward to is instead of right now, what we do is staff will review plans and then type their comments into a field, and then we'll generate a template. Staff can put their comments in here, and then it will just automatically generate a formatted report, so you don't have to essentially duplicate. Also, you can turn comments on and off for various reviewers or various departments. We can have staff working in the same document at the same time. So folks can be talking on the phone, say planning and transportation planning, and saying, here, I'm looking at the sheet or this driveway, here's what I'm putting in, and it's immediate, it's real time. Staff's super excited about this. We expect this to save us a lot of time and help our customers. There will be training for both staff and our customers anticipated for April. We haven't figured out the details of that yet, but we'll probably have some online training, and we'll be working with our consultant for best practices.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Any questions for staff right now? Member Jordan.
I just want to go all the way back to the announcements. And Eli, could you remind me or Mark, on the ombudsman's roles, what type of projects and what is the referral protocol?
Yeah, I'm just getting to the. So for the ombudsman, it's so the role is supposed to serve businesses, TIs, multi-unit developments, and basically anything that the director is also going to say I should have purview over, or somebody needs help. And it can be someone who's putting in a sink or someone who just has questions about the process. Part of it is to address their concerns. I usually take the opportunity to teach as well, right? Sometimes we learn and sometimes they learn. Sometimes we both learn. But so far it has been meeting with folks who've had difficult projects. They've gotten certain responses from different departments, and they're questioning those, and they've asked me to step in and maybe translate what's coming back to them and vice versa. So I'm just now in the process of transitioning. I'm coming out of building and safety, still working with Raven a little bit as she assumes my previous role.
So, I never get those emails. And so what's the protocol for a referral? Does it go to the top of the pile or to you directly, or?
Well, what I've seen is emails to the mayor and to some council members who then send them to Eli, and then Eli sends them to me.
Okay. And then, so safely, I could just entirely rule out single-family residential, right?
For the most part, I would say yes.
Okay,
That's not
perfect.
the focus of this role.
All right, thank you.
Member Gutierrez.
Mr. Aguilar, I just had a question. We're phasing out from the direct emails and phone calls with this new program, but can people still, email or phone call staff? Or is it?
So what this program does is by taking away the phone and email channels, is we don't have to have the inspectors come in early and transcribe information from maybe potentially a garbled voicemail or an incorrect email, right? The customer is going directly to their building permit online, all the information's there, and they're just choosing a date and a time and an inspection type. And so that comes in, it populates everything. The inspectors can come in and they can see it because it automatically assigns it to an inspector based on the area of the address. We also have as a backup in case the cella is down in the morning for some reason, we're having reports automatically sent at 6:31 a.m. so that we can pick up anything that came in the prior day.
And if I could just add to that, Committee Member Gutierrez, applicants are already very familiar with the ACA system at this time. So they've used the ACA system for any planning work that's been done on this permit. They've submitted for their building permit application through ACA. So our customers are very used to using that system by the time they're calling for inspection. So we're not asking them to all of a sudden change their process or to sign up for a new account. So while we're keeping that sort of other channels of communication open for emergency situations and sort of unique situations, we really do need to force people to that new system. And so we're really trying to cut that off as much as we can to really get people to adopt the online request process, just because for the reasons Mark mentioned, it's saves staff so much time and is so much more accurate in terms of understanding the type of inspection request that's needed and where it's needed.
Thank you. The reason that I thought of the question was because it's an online program, and I was thinking, what about the lights go off, or the system's down? But Mr. Aguilar answered the question, so thank you.
Perfect. I just have a couple of different questions. So back to the announcements, the senior plan check engineer, it's vacant. Mr. Isaacson, you had said that it's been vacant for 2 years. Is that right? And
Roughly, it's
the reasoning what is the reasoning behind that?
I'd like actually Tina, our CBO Tina Dye to weigh in on that, but part of it is it's a very specialized skill set, and it's one that's just difficult to recruit for in general. I think there's also hopefully our class and compensation study that's being done by our HR department will verify that we are offering an appropriate salary for that position, and if not, we can make the appropriate changes to that position such that we are competitive in our recruitments.
Yeah, Chair Friedman. The only thing I can really add to that is he basically explained exactly what the issue has been, but we have made an offer to an applicant, and so we're waiting to see if he's accepted, a structural engineer.
Oh, great. Good news. Hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed. You kind of answered my questions is, do we need to change our compensation or whatnot to recruit? But it seems like hopefully we'll have a different answer next time we have a meeting. So on to building and safety. If you could pull up slide 8. So what, this is, I just wanted to clarify this for insurance purposes. This is a great achievement actually for us in the city, but also, as I understand it for the public, this could potentially help them with their own insurance rates. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
In terms of lowering their insurance, right?
Lowering, yeah. Better score, lower.
So, being that insurance right now for the public is a major issue of inflation and other things on their bottom line, what efforts are we, there's a lot of great things from here, but in this in particular, which are we planning to make any efforts of public outreach using our public information officer or others to let the public know that this took place and that it should help them further? I just want to make sure that we're publicizing this and the public knows the value of what's taking place here.
Chair Friedman, we would be happy to work with our PIO to make sure our residents know of this achievement and how it impacts their own insurance rates for their property.
Yeah, I think it's important that we hear a lot of complaints about community development, and when we get something that can definitely benefit, I think it's important to highlight the great work that staff's doing. Just 2 more questions on this. On slide 13. Just so I understand this slide, this would help not only for any project, but it could help with housing projects as well. And what's the purpose behind this training? Is it more for our staff to have a full 360 of what the costs are for projects and especially these larger projects, the development projects and housing of how what we do here impacts those. So can you just get a little more detail on this?
Sure, and I would not call this a deep training. It was just kind of more almost an annual exposure to keep this at the forefront of our minds when staff are making decisions or trying to act on certain tasks, application-related tasks. We've had this before, and I think it may have been mentioned in the Novak report from a few years back, that it was something that they'd like to see staff be cognizant of. So that's really more what this was. And they did use, I think, housing examples in the Bay Area.
Great. So it just helps with our staff have a full understanding of the costs that go into different projects. So perfect. And then my last question on the interdepartmental effort, slide 14. So this will help the efficiencies of when we're reviewing plans because you can put it right on the feedback right on the plans in real time, as you were saying. So this will also get into the efficiencies and save our customers more time, applicants more time as well.
That's correct, yes.
Perfect. And just any public comment on on this item, the building safety updates? Not hearing any. Are there any comments? Member Gutierrez.
Sorry, I actually have a random question to ask. For the vacancies, do we have staff already? Like, do we have a planner, plan check engineer? Is this like a second vacancy that we need?
That's a great
Like,
question.
I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking, whoa, like, who's doing the job? Like, this is not good.
Thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. So 3 of the vacancies there in building and safety are due to promotions. So they're recently vacant positions, and that's the residential plans examiner, a building permit technician, and the senior building inspector. Those are all a result of recent promotions.
Perfect. So before we move on, I just want to say thank you to all of our staff for the great work you're doing. These are great improvements, and it just shows that we are trying to address it. And it goes into the Vision 2030 that we're trying as an organization to make our organization more fiscally sustainable and operational efficiency. So this is in line with that. So now we'll move on to item B, the Single Family Design Board improvements, process improvements update.
Thank you, Chair and Council members. I'm Allison DeBusk, City Planner in Community Development, and I wanted to give you an update on the Single Family Design Board process improvements that are underway. This program is being managed by Ted Hamilton-Roll, who's in the front row, along with Ellen Kokinda, the Design Review Supervisor. As a reminder, some of the key goals of these process improvements are to reduce the number of projects that need to go to the Single Family Design Board, and also to expand opportunities for administrative approvals, which is essentially a staff approval. We went to the SFDB Subcommittee, as well as the AIA Advocacy Group last fall, and that was to discuss some ideas for code amendments. We then, just this past Monday, went to the SFDB to have a discussion about some proposed code amendments, and we will be having that same discussion with the Planning Commission on March 21st. The next steps for this project are to draft the formal code and guideline amendments and circulate those internally for review, as well as get review by the city attorney. And that will be followed up by review by the Planning Commission and Ordinance Committee, and then hopefully adoption by the City Council by the end of this year. Any questions on this item?
Great. Any questions? Member Jordan.
Thank you. So I browsed through, just looking sideways at the meeting on Monday, and it I don't know, seemed a little like a clunky response in terms from some of the Single-Family Design Board members. And I was just wondering where you are in that with ideas on really moving forward on lessening their role and some of the reactions I read was maybe it wasn't resolved at that meeting and if it has to come back there, or what, how are we doing on that?
Ms. Kokinda?
Thank you so much through you, Chair Friedman, to the committee members. So I'm curious if there were specific things, because generally, I think I think just understanding the single-family design board are going to be the most conservative with these particular code amendments. And I mean, you all have been integral in directing us to say, we really are looking for single-family process improvements. We need to cut back on the number of design review triggers. We feel like we're trying to maintain the essence of the single-family design board while cutting back on a lot of the minor alteration projects that we just need to let go of some of that aesthetic oversight that we've clung on to for so long and that have continued to be added to SFDB's plate through different other process improvements. So it's not necessarily surprising in some ways that the design review board is going to hold those aesthetics closest to heart. So I think as we kind of move our way through this process, Planning Commission might feel a little bit more open, maybe a little bit more sympathetic to individual homeowners, but I think we have to keep that context in mind of how can we still maintain oversight, deal with the big things, you know, make sure that we're maintaining the intentions of the single-family design board to not McMansionize everything, or, you know, really make sure that we maintain a public forum for issues that we know there are going to be neighborhood contentions, but let go of some of the smaller items.
You probably described what made my, hairs on the back of my neck tingle while I was multitasking, and we're partly at fault too, I think, because over the last couple recruitments, I think we've worked really hard to put strong neighborhood representation there, and probably said, go get them, be strong, be good, and then it's kind of contradictory too. Then as soon as you put them there, you kind of say, okay, but we want to take some of that stuff away from you. So yeah, I think you described the feeling really well.
Thank you. And if I could just add, I do want to recognize that we have one board member who put in their resignation. I know you have your spring recruitment. We are actively trying to help out with the recruitment, but also if you know of anybody who would be a really good candidate, the membership is wide open. It could be a public at large they have to be a resident of the city. It could be someone with professional qualifications in the county or a licensed architect. We do have 3 licensed architects currently, so thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any members of the public, not seeing a closed public comment, and now we'll move on to the large item for the day, housing element workload discussion. Mr. Isaacson.
Thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. I'm going to turn this presentation over to City Planner Allison DeBusk. She'll be walking us through the slides. I may be chiming in along the way just to add a little context to some of the things that are being shared. But we're really hoping that this tees up a meaningful conversation. We successfully adopted a housing element earlier this year. And now as we're shifting gears towards implementation, we are really looking at what it's going to take from a staffing perspective to keep the timeline and commitments we've made in terms of specific policies and programs and bringing those online. And so we wanted to kind of share with you some of our initial thinking and understanding of where we will be successful and where we may be challenged, just so you're aware of that and we can think through how we may approach some of those challenges moving forward. So with that, I'd like to turn over to our city planner.
Thank you. And to repeat what Mr. Isaacson said, I'm going to start with the good news, and that's that HCD accepted our housing element on February 13th, 2024. So we're very excited to say that. We're happy to be through that work effort, and now we're excited to take on the next steps. So what are those next steps? It means implementation of all of the housing element programs, and it also means a lot of work, but it's something that we're excited to take on because these are the programs that really affect people locally. They're where we can do things that directly relate to our community and have the most impact. I'm not going to lie, though, it's a little bit overwhelming. There were a lot of programs that were adopted in the housing element. There are also timelines in which we need to complete them. And we admittedly have very few staff that are able to work on those things. Also, I did want to mention that the timelines that are in the housing element, those were negotiated with HCD staff. And then also were discussed at Planning Commission and City Council. And some of the feedback that we got at those meetings was that they wanted to do more sooner. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge. We have started planning for how we're going to tackle these projects. And as noted, we see a big crunch coming. And that's what we want to walk you through today. There are a lot of factors that contribute to this, both internal and external. Some of the external factors include new state mandates that we need to address, housing element implementation, which is what we're going to focus on today, as well as new and expanded programs such as parklets and outdoor dining on private property. And then we also have the internal factors such as technology integrations, including the DigiPlan that you just heard about, and our SharePoint migration. These are all great improvements that we're looking forward to, but they do take a lot of staff time to implement. And then we're continually working on process improvements and streamlining in order to make the process at least a little bit easier wherever we can. And finally, we've got the day-to-day operations, review of private development projects, building plan check. And the reality is that these seem to be increasingly complex project applications. We tend to joke that all of the easy sites have already been developed, and what's left is not that easy to get through. So diving into the details, the Planning Division has over 50 projects that we really want to work on in the near future. This isn't even 50 projects. What's on your screen here that I know you can't read because it's too small are all of the programs that were identified in the housing element as needing to get done. There were 32 programs within the housing element, and then we've also got the annual progress report from the general plan that needs to be completed. As I mentioned, completion of these 32 programs must be done within certain timelines that are identified in the housing element. And also, as we get towards the end of this 7-year period, so prior to 2031, we need to start thinking about the 7th element, housing element. You know, this is a cycle that just keeps going. Unfortunately, as you know, completion of the 6th cycle housing element took an additional year to get completed. And this has resulted in us basically being behind by a year in implementing all of these programs. So that has essentially condensed all of the timelines, and also a lot of the work efforts are front-loaded within the 7-year time period. So as I said, this list is overwhelming, so we're not going to talk about it. We're going to focus in on just those items that need to be completed within the next 3 years. So we have 16 programs that need to be implemented by the end of 2026. In addition to those, we have our housing plan EIR that we are working on currently and will be completing in order to serve as the environmental review for a lot of these projects. We also have the general plan annual progress report, as I mentioned before. We also need to update our safety element for the general plan and also update the open space element. Some of the programs within the housing element are things that are a very high priority. They're things we want to get done very quickly, one of which is the adaptive reuse ordinance. You'll see that the timeline to complete is by December 2025, but there's a high desire to get that done a lot quicker than that. Also, I want to acknowledge that some of those programs involve multiple components, and so I'm using HE9 as an example of that. HE9 actually has 6 components to it that all need to be implemented. And some of those are complicated, such as creek setback requirements and oak woodland protection. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to explain what goes into implementing these programs. Many of them require either new ordinances or ordinance amendments. This is the portion of the ordinance process that the council is probably most familiar with, starting with Planning Commission. And just so that you're aware, the review cycle for Planning Commission getting onto an agenda takes about 30 days. It's similar for Ordinance Committee, similar for City Council, and then we have a week between introduction and adoption at City Council, and then another 30 days until the ordinance can go into effect. So in total, this is 127 days of process, which is more than 4 months. It's a long time. We do whatever we can to condense some of these steps. You know, for example, we might be drafting our City Council agenda report before we've gone to Ordinance Committee in order to reduce some of these timelines. But sometimes they get extended because meetings are canceled, or we get feedback from Planning Commission or Ordinance Committee about edits that need to be made. And so the process could also take longer. But before we can even get into that 4-month ordinance process, we have the preliminary phase of the project, which involves research, mapping, public engagement, then drafting the ordinance language itself, may include work group meetings or design review meetings, and also requires environmental review. And so this is the part of the process that's a little bit more variable in terms of the amount of time devoted to it. I do want to note that public engagement is a bit of a different animal than it used to be. There are so many different ways to communicate with the public and engage them, and so that has become a more difficult and time-consuming aspect of the project, I would say. But hopefully the result is that we're getting more people involved than may have been involved otherwise. And I want to use a real-life example of how this plays out. This is the timeline for the Objective Design and Development Standards, otherwise known as ODDS. We were awarded a grant back in 2021 for a consultant to work on these standards. We had a visual preferences survey that was out for the public. We held focus group interviews. We had work group meetings. And then in mid-2022, we got an admin draft from the consultant, held more work group meetings. ABR and HLC reviewed it multiple times. And then we also did outreach with an architectural styles map, and that was available to the public to comment on for several months. In mid-2023, the public draft of ODDS was released. Then we had a planning commission meeting. And then in 2024, we've had 2 work group meetings so far. We anticipate the final draft of ODDS being available in the near future and holding ABR, HLC, and Planning Commission meetings this spring. We would then go to Ordinance Committee in the summer and City Council in the fall. So this was a long process. It's stretched out over 3 years, which is not ideal. One of the main reasons that happened is due to the limited staff. We had the same staff member working on this that was working on the housing element. So whenever the housing element came to the forefront, this project had to go to the back burner. And so you may be thinking that that was really poor planning on your part. Why would you assign the same project to the same person? Again, a couple reasons. One is that there aren't too many options. There weren't other staff that could really take it on. But then also the housing element, we had anticipated getting a consultant to work on that. When that didn't happen, it put more work on this one staff person. And it also took a year longer to get finished. Had that not happened, this could have moved forward a lot quicker. So I just say doing the best that we can with what we have, but this is kind of shows the inefficiencies of having one person handling multiple high priority projects at the same time. So this is the org chart for the planning division. And as I said, the staff resources to work on these programs are limited. Based on the nature of the types of programs that are required to be implemented by the housing element, it really requires long-range planning and special studies staff. Currently, we have 3 of those. And even if we had other staff that maybe had a lower workload in other parts of the city, which isn't the case right now, they're fully absorbed with the day-to-day work, but they also have a different skill set. Their skill set is working on current private development, not necessarily project management of these longer-term efforts. The long-range section in the planning division has grown and shrunk over the years, excuse me, typically dependent on the workload at the time. As an example, back in 2006, we had 4 1/4 full-time equivalents in long-range planning, plus a GIS technician. And currently, we're down to 3. Most recently, through the budget process, we lost a planner to the sustainability department, and then also the GIS technician was transferred into the IT department, so we no longer get 100% of his time. And many of the projects are related to affordable housing. However, our Housing and Human Services program is likewise, does not have the staff to accommodate that. They used to have a project planner, but that position was cut a few years ago. So this slide shows the housing element programs that we think our internal staff can feasibly accomplish over the next 3 years. And this does cover a lot of work. We think it's even ambitious, the number of projects that we've shown. Excuse me, but it still leaves us with 6 projects that are unassigned. And those 6 projects are shown on this slide. Sorry, it's not quite as legible as I had hoped. But also want to acknowledge that there may be work efforts that you want to happen faster than the timeline that was identified, or things that weren't even shown on this that may be high priority that you want to bump up in the workload. Excuse me. And some of these projects may be good candidates for consultants, but we just want to acknowledge that even when you have a consultant, it does take a fair amount of staff time to manage that consultant and coordinate and consult with them as well. What we found is that consultants are most effective when they're addressing a specific policy issue or analyzing a particular thing rather than managing the whole program itself. Sure, absolutely. The top one is HE3, Special Needs Housing. Then we have HE9, Resource Protection and Development Certainty, and that was the one that I showed earlier that has the 6 different components. We have HE9, Short-Term Rental Framework and Ordinance. HE13, Inclusionary Housing Code Amendments. HE6, ADU Affordability and Amendments. And HE14, Land Use Inventory. So HE14 relates to inventorying existing city property that could be potentially used for housing. So in conclusion, we know that many of the state's mandates have no associated funding, and we understand that that is frustrating, but we also recognize that housing, and particularly affordable housing, is one of the highest priorities in this community. So therefore, our recommendation is that the City Council prioritize affordable housing programs and direct resources to those divisions or departments that provide support to those efforts. What we've identified is that we think this can be accomplished with 2 temporary planners in the long-range section, as well as 1 project planner in the housing section. And I also want to note that the ADU workload has not slowed down at all. We currently have an hourly staff person that does all of the building plan checks for ADUs, and realistically, that is a full-time position and really warrants that level of hours devoted to it. And so with that, I will conclude, and we can move into questions or discussion.
Before I turn it over to questions, could you just clarify what you mean by the first recommendation, 2 term planners versus full-time planners, what you mean in terms of timeframes and what the difference would be.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. We understand that committing to permanent staff is a big deal. And we are seeing this as a temporary crunch, essentially, of all the projects being front-loaded. And so we think that hiring people with a limited term, haven't exactly identified exactly what that might be, but that would be a way to get through this workload effort and might be more efficient than hiring contract planners.
But it could possibly be for a few years, not somebody who's going to come in and do one project and leave. Right?
That's correct.
All right, so I will open up to questions from my colleagues who'd like to start. Member Gutierrez?
So ideally, how many more staff members would we need? So we're now in budget season, and just for budgeting purpose, what would be ideal for this department to have to be able to, run those 6 programs?
Thank you, Chair Friedman, Committee Member Gutierrez. So the recommendation in front of you represents the addition of 3.5 FTE. So that's the 2 term planners in long range. Those would be full-time employees. They would receive benefits. It just wouldn't be permanent positions. They would have, we're thinking something in the range of a 5-year term planner position. That's something that I think is a long enough duration to attract talented candidates. Also, as Ms. DeBusk mentioned, it gets us through this sort of front-loaded crunch of the housing element. And then, over time, we can, through, other vacancies that are created as people move around, we can absorb those into our sort of permanent org chart. But we think that that's a good way to address some of the needs, as Ms. DeBusk identified, around the housing element. The housing project planner and housing that was discussed, that was the result of having multiple part-time jobs, positions in that group that we were recruiting for simultaneously, and we're not able to find candidates willing to take on less than full-time work. And so the housing project planner position was sort of dissolved and directed towards making full-time positions out of those part-time positions. We see that as a really critical need in that group to make changes to our affordable housing policies and procedures. So that's really critical. And then the last one is maybe less dire. However, as Ms. DeBusk mentioned, we are not seeing any decline in the number of ADU applications that are coming in. And as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, this notion of a increasingly complex regulatory environment that we're working on, that absolutely applies in the area of ADUs. As more and more legislation comes down from Sacramento, we are struggling to keep up and to train and incorporate those new regulations into our processes. And so having more bandwidth, more resources in that area of our operation would certainly allow us to process more ADU applications faster. And so again, this recommendation represents roughly 3.5 FTEs added to the planning division and housing divisions in community development.
Thank you.
Member Jordan?
Thank you. Because I've done this too before I forget, I'll tell you again. When you do these priority lists, it would be more beneficial, I think, if you'd group the priorities together rather than the numerical HE numbers. So you can you don't have to jump around and, oh yeah, there's a high down there, and try and marry it back up with the other highs if you just married them all together. And then I don't understand the 3 slides. So it's 23, 31, and 32. So the 23 slide has what I think you called the 16 programs required to be completed in the next 3 years, right? Okay, and then when you go to 31, which you already also said what could potentially be accomplished in the next 3 years, some like HE1, I'll just pick on that, that's a very high, and you say December 25th, but that's not on the one until it's unassigned, even though it's a very high. and it's going to be accomplished potentially by December 2025, and there are other December 2025s on the middle slide, right? You follow where I'm going here?
I'm actually noticing that HE1 isn't on here at all.
Yeah, so,
Yes.
Yeah.
Good catch.
I don't know. So I think, again, if you were to redistribute those lines in priority groups, then you, and then, just add another column to the left on the subsequent two slides to reaffirm what those priorities were that we're carrying over to those two slides. So you don't have to go back 12 slides and try and figure out, well, is this one here because it's a very high or a high or whatever it is. I have some questions. Hang on. I have to find where I wrote them. So I just want to pick on HE1, which you say is very high priority and is moving ahead pretty quickly. So I'm of the impression that adaptive reuse of commercial spaces is one of the hardest things to do in this town due to building codes. So I'm just wondering, why is that one of the very high priorities? And how does that measure up towards effort in terms of what we have to do versus a return on the other end of actual units?
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. We think it's one that we've talked about with Planning Commission and City Council for a while. And so we think that drafting it is not going to be difficult. We've essentially got the framework for it. You're correct. We've heard that in terms of construction and that sort of thing, it's very difficult. But we want to give people that opportunity. We have certainly met with several developers who have properties downtown who have asked us about it, who want to do it. But right now, we can't give them the density that makes it work. So that would be the goal, is that we can give them the density so they can at least pursue it and it becomes an option to them. A lot of these buildings are being adaptively reused as hotels. That's just as expensive. So if they can do it for that, then we think they can do it for residential if we can give them the density that helps them get there.
Isn't one of the key differences there and having to do with fires and multiple ingress and egress per room or and stuff like, I mean, everybody's got the du jour one of the sur la table one, but that was very unique in terms of its structural composition, already sprinklered, that kind of thing. And so, I don't know, just when you talk to Brian Cornell and walk around town and he goes, it was kind of a unicorn. And so, but if you think there's potential there, I'm in. It just seems like it's up at the very high, and I don't know. Tina, did you have some input for me? Some help?
Thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. There are complexities in meeting building codes with these existing buildings, but it's not impossible. Maybe less units so that the conversion could work with egress and ingress. Those are very important life safety features that we take very seriously. So it's not impossible. And we are considering code alternates. We've been working with Mr. Cernal to explore some code alternates.
Okay. And then when we're looking at like the big list on 23 and your narrative on whoever was the poor soul who was sharing regular planning duties with the housing element, or maybe multiple souls, how do we get a sense where that dynamic exists on all these HE numbers? And which ones, even though their priority is high or very high or low, that they're not burdened with a potential to run into that again when you're not using all of a staff member's time and he's doing something else, but all of a sudden something goes sideways, like guilty. 7 people up here could send you sideways, or something else. New law comes down, and so how do we get a sense when we see a list of this, when we're trying to say, oh, good, you're saying HE1 is very high, and we're going to jump on that, but then 2 years from now you're back and saying, oh, we're still working on HE1 because this came along, this came along, this came along, and we had to move resources off of that. So is there a way to get a sense on aligning the very highs with a static a resource that won't get pulled away, or is that just too much of a play with all the moving pieces kind of thing?
If Chair Friedman, Councilmember Jordan, if I could jump in on that, I think one of the messages we're trying to deliver today is that pulling away that happened with, say, odds and the housing element update is frankly unavoidable at the staffing level we currently have. And so that is why we need a little bit of a deeper bench and a little more resiliency so that we do have the ability to respond to things as they come up. Right now, we are not in a position to respond if things come up. We're not in a position to deal with a staff member being out to take care of a sick family member. We're not in a position for someone to say, hey, I've received a more attractive offer from another organization. We are extremely thin in extremely critical areas of our organization to the extent that we have several critical single point failures in our org chart. And that is really what we're trying to illustrate for you today. We could get sort of bogged down in some of the nitty gritty of, is this prioritized correctly? Why is it shown here? Why is it shown there? We can certainly clean that up so this is a presentation we can continue to show to other bodies. But the real takeaway in my mind is just showing just how thin we are, how down to the bone we are, and how just as things come up, we don't have the flexibility and the adaptability I think council would like us to have to be able to do multiple things at once.
Yep. So I think you need to elevate that talking point in the conversation, especially as we're ramping up for budget, because some of us who have been sitting here in different roles and seen that silly horizontal colored graph for 15 years, Allison knows what I'm talking about, the same things stay on it. And so when you're looking at this, you're going, oh, good, you're going to get to this, you're going to get to this. The point you need to make is that's only a picture in time right now, and it's subject to the same dynamics that you've seen 5 years ago and 10 years ago, that'll stay on a list if we don't have more help, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and I appreciate that feedback. I think the one other thing that I think was sort of maybe buried in some of the comments we made earlier is just the inherent inefficiency in that bouncing back and forth, right? As you shift gears from odds to housing element to then picking odds back up again to then switching gears to the housing element, there's a loss of momentum, there's a loss of just effectiveness and efficiency that is associated with that sort of jumping around. And to be able to sort of have dedicated resources on specific projects for long durations of time, there's just an inherent benefit to that in terms of the timeliness to get things completed. We unfortunately have not had the luxury of doing that. I mean, I think as a manager of a department that would, and as to speak for Allison as the manager of a division, I mean, that would be the ideal scenario. Unfortunately, due to our staffing levels, that just hasn't been the reality. And so we are coming to you saying, we think to get these things done and to maintain the commitments we've made both to you as a council and to our larger community, we are really going to be challenged by our current staffing levels, and we want you to be aware of that now.
Okay. And then when is the proper time and method to quibble about these priorities?
Well, Chair Friedman, Councilmember Jordan, I mean, I think part of why we've been talking about these priorities for quite a while. We didn't make these priorities in preparation for this presentation. We pulled these priorities as they were established in the housing element. So these are our sort of documented priorities as reflected in the timelines we've committed to in the housing element. So in my mind, these priorities have been established. If there's a need to revisit them, I'm sure we could do that. But this is our understanding of our quote-unquote marching orders vis-a-vis the housing element that was adopted in this February.
So when would be the revisiting method and protocol then, I guess?
I'm going to have to turn it over to Ms. DeBusk to answer that
or
one.
tell me you don't want one, or just flat out, just shut me down. but
Well, I mean, I think that personally, I would like to start completing some of these things before we
Yeah.
rejigger the priorities. So, you know, we are aligned. We've been doing quite a bit. We didn't present it today, but we've been doing a lot of work. Mr. Aguilar, Brenda Belts, our planning analyst, as well as our admin team, have been bringing online a really powerful project management tool and resource allocation tool for the planning division. So we are actively sort of allocating our staffing resources to these projects as we speak, and we think we've put together a ambitious but doable sort of plan for the next 2 to 3 years in terms of getting these things done. That is our intention, is to approach these things as they are sort of prioritized in front of you now. If we need to reprioritize something, we're certainly obviously more than happy to have that conversation and figure out how to make it work.
all right, we'll do it separate from here. One last question. You start off on like the first slide, and I just wanted to confirm what you said, and that's that the timeline on that first one with the 32 programs, those have been negotiated with HCD. So we're not making those up because we like to do something and we don't like to do something else. Those, because everybody I know is going to want to quibble about timelines and priorities too that are different than my timelines and priorities. But we just didn't throw darts at a dartboard. Those have been talked about through the whole multi-year process with HCD, and they're looking for us to meet those timelines, if not better those timelines, right? Okay, thanks.
That is correct.
All right, thank you. I have a few questions, and I'll open it up for public comment, and then we'll come back for deliberations. So my first question, if you could pull up 33, getting to the recommendation. So a couple questions on this. One is, you know, it's no secret we have budget structural challenges at the city. We're in a deficit this year, so obviously this would be difficult. But so first is, if we weren't able to, as a council during the budget process, come to fund all of these, which one of these would be the priority? And then part B of the question is, would you have like would you have a recommendation or thoughts on how to maybe implement these over the course of 1 or 2 years, especially given that this is year 2 of a budget and next year is the 2-year budget? So perhaps we do one this year, or and then the other 2 in the next budget. So what are your thoughts on those, of the priority and the timing?
Thank you, Chair Friedman, members of the committee. So one thing I think it's important to keep in mind, as positions get created through the budget process, the annual costs of those positions in the first year usually are not 100%. And that's for just, there's a period of time it takes to recruit and onboard and get someone in the door. And so the first year sort of burden on the budget is less than, say, year 2, just for that sort of reason. It doesn't typically consist of sort of a full year of cost. But if I were to prioritize what you see in front of you, you know, in year 1, I would really, you know, there's pros and cons to this approach, but my preference would be to bring on board the housing project planner as well as one of our planners in long range in year 1, and then year 2, bring on the second term planner and convert the ADU to a full-time position. Alternatively, there's a case to be made for bringing on both term planners in long range in year 1. The reason for that is there are some efficiencies in bringing both individuals on at the same time. But you know, I mentioned sort of single point failures in the organization, in the department, and that one of those is in our Housing and Human Services department. And so just from a redundancy, resiliency, having a bench, that housing planner is critical.
That's good feedback just for the future discussions that, depending on what we do here today, that you'd be having with the city administrator, and then ultimately council as a whole would need that information. And then just as a follow-up to that, when we're talking about having 3.5 staffers to be able to implement these programs, can you speak to the other departments that would possibly, not what their staffing would be, but what other departments. It's because my understanding of how it works is it might not just be your department. We might need city attorneys or others. Are there other departments that you work with that would possibly need to upstaff as well?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. So we work extremely closely with the city attorney's office. As Ms. DeBusk mentioned, many of these policies and programs require either new ordinances or amendments to existing ordinance. That involves quite a bit of support from our city attorney's office. There are also, as you know, there's a pilot program currently in place around short-term rental enforcement. That's another area where if we do move forward with a short-term rental ordinance at some point in the future, there would be coordination and staffing requirements needed in both community development as well as on the enforcement side in the attorney's office to make sure that that program is successful. The land development team, it's important to note the land development team is not just community development. The land development team spans multiple departments. It includes public works, it includes sustainability and resilience, it includes the fire department and other public safety functions. But it's hard for me to see how this sort of policy work that we're talking about vis-a-vis the housing element, I'm not clear how that impacts those departments, but I do think it's fair to say that there would be a need possibly for additional resources in the city attorney's office to support those work efforts.
Okay, I just wanted to put that out there because it would be part of the discussion, because if we were to move forward with you, there's implications on that as well. Just a couple more questions. I think if it's slide 32 or 30, actually, it's one of these, 32 or 33. So one of the things that comes up, say there was the staffing support you needed, and there are, this comes out of the Planning Commission today that they were discussing, well, they actually weren't discussing this because it wasn't on their agenda, but they wanted to discuss this. So we were prepared. We knew it was coming, and we were thinking along the lines of the commissioners. So one of the questions is some of the priorities. I'll use adaptive reuse since we had it in our presentation here, and it frequently comes up at council and came up today. It's the end of 2025, and so if we wanted to prioritize that and move that up, I know there's that whole process that you went through. I mean, there's 4 months of just from Planning Commission to us at council. What would it take? If we had these 3 staffing, is that the only way or the recommended way to bump that up, or what levers can we pull to speed some of those up that are known as priorities?
Chair Friedman, I would say that is one of the top priorities that as a department we have identified wanting to complete. Our goal is to complete it this year. The other 2 big work efforts in that realm are single-family design board updates and the odds program. So those are kind of the 3 main ordinance things that we are hoping to get through this year.
But even though when you have it as 25, that's giving our current staffing capabilities, and that realistically that could be to that. We don't want to put something out there and then not meet the timelines.
Chair Friedman, that was the date identified in the housing element because we wanted to be cautious and not overcommit. We still think there's a lot that's teed up for the first few years. But again, we also think that's something that's maybe less research intensive, so it's something we can jump right into a little quicker than maybe some of these other workloads. And so I think it would also be nice to just be able to check some of these things off.
Exactly. So that could be a priority quicker than the December of 25, but also whether or not we're able to get some of these additional positions would also help us meet that timeline or exceed it, get us more in the timeline that we want rather than what's in the housing element.
Correct.
Okay. And then I guess it kind of answers my questions because the issue of like short-term the next slide that has these priorities, which are not, they haven't had any assigned staff, is that correct to it? So even though those are the timelines, we haven't assigned staff, And so that's the challenge that we would have there in terms of moving those forward. I see one of them is the short-term rental framework, and then also the land use inventory, because I think that's a huge one for us to be able to plan for the housing, and that's not coming out until December of '27. That's halfway through our time frame. So again, this is what these additional positions would help us more front-loaded, but speed up that process, as I understand it. Okay. And then the last question I have before public comment is, in terms of going back to the recommended positions, have we identified any potential funding sources for those?
We have, we've identified those. I'd prefer not to go into that this afternoon, only because I have not had the privilege of discussing this with our city administrator at this point, and so I'd prefer not to go into the details. But we have identified some potential sources of funding, specifically for the term planners in long range, as well as the ADU. Those are sort of the ADU position there's fee for service associated with that, a little different in long range, but we think we may have identified some options. The one area where we're really struggling to find some good options is the housing project planner, and our current model for supporting staff in that division is unsustainable if it's also being asked to support additional staff person, and that's the reason why that staff person isn't there. But we see this as such a critical need that even though we didn't have a source identified, we still wanted to bring it to your attention this afternoon.
Perfect. I didn't want to go into a lower or higher level of detail. It was more general to say that these are priorities. You've been looking at them, but even looking at it, there's no easy answer to fund it, or else you would have already probably funded it. So because there are trade-offs with other priorities, other departments that council would need to do. But that last point was critical because that's the one you mentioned, that there's pinch points as well. So with that, for questions done here, Member Gutierrez?
For the short-term rental framework, are we using our own code enforcement team? Are they working with the city attorney, or how?
So, Chair Friedman, Council or Committee Member Gutierrez, thank you for the question. So we have a process in place for following up on, it's a complaint-based system around short-term rentals. But we've also initiated a pilot program roughly 6-8 months ago. I'm not quite exactly sure on the timing of that, which is focusing more on prosecution and looking at uncollected TOT. That effort is really being led out of the city attorney's office and is less focused out of community development. And so we really want to have the benefit of some returns in terms of data on the successfulness of this new approach, because we really think that enforcement is going to be the key element of undergirding any framework or ordinance we move forward with. And so we have not moved forward on that in the past year or so, really waiting to see, are we more effective taking this approach? And I think we have been, that's what I've heard, but we want to kind of get the full benefit of that pilot program and the data we've collected before we make any decisions, before moving forward with the new ordinance.
The reason I'm asking is because we're talking about the need of more staff, and we're going to get a report, I think, really soon, within the next maybe 4 weeks, on that pilot program, and I'm just thinking ahead. We're probably going to also need more code enforcement officers.
We may.
Okay.
That could very well be a outcome of that pilot program is the need for additional code enforcement personnel.
Thank you.
All right, members of the public, Ms. Black, come on up to the microphone.
I think it's on. Okay. Thank you, Chair Friedman, and members of this committee, I guess you are. I didn't even know you existed until about 2 weeks ago. I have 1,000 thoughts swirling in my head, some of which are creating PTSD from my time at the county. But I thought maybe explain, well, I'm here representing the League of Women Voters as well. Sort of explaining what we do at the county, and it sounds like this is a little bit moving in that direction. And Eric, I think, is quite, or Chair Friedman is quite familiar with this. Sorry, we know each other. We went through a work program for our long-range planning division every single year. And we would do sort of a 1-year projection and a 3 to 5 year projection. And then the Board of Supervisors would actually adopt that, and they would adopt a staffing level that they would finalize as part of the budget. So it seems like that's a little bit what you're trying to do here today. The thing that we did, though, is the board adopted it, and then the only way it could change is if the board changed it. And we would come back throughout the year and report on how we were doing and meeting our goals in the work program, and, staffing issues arise and things like that. But it was really a good accountability tool for everybody involved. It kept the board from coming to us and saying, we want you to work on this. And it's like, well, if you get 2 other board members to say that in a public hearing, we're glad to do it. So so it protects your staff, and it also holds your staff accountable, and everybody knows what's expected. So I'm really glad to see that you do this. And I don't know if this is the first time or if this is something that you do every year, but I think it's a really, really good tool. And I would recommend that you take it a step further, and maybe this is what you intend to do, take it to the city council. And you might want to look at integrating other long-range planning priorities, not just the housing element. And maybe they are, and you're just calling them part of the housing element, because those things get in the way as well. So that's my little lecture. From the league's perspective, I don't know if I have a certain amount of time. There's no way I'm going to be able to finish in a minute, but
I'll give you a couple. You're the only public comment, so.
yeah, and sorry about that. I feel like I'm stalking you, and I don't mean to be. In terms of staffing, I totally support your request for staffing, and I hope that the city council will in the budget process. The league had the opportunity to meet with the mayor and several of your budget staff back in December, and we were asked what our priorities were. And, aside from basic city services that we obviously want the city to maintain, our biggest priority is affordable housing. And we want to make sure that the programs in the housing element are done expeditiously and well, and we think you need the staffing to be able to do that. So we totally support that. I'm not sure you really have to say that those planning positions are term positions, because let's be realistic. In 5 years, you're going to be working on the housing element again, and you're going to need more staff. So you can say that, but between attrition in staff and demands that are going to come up in the future, I would really be surprised if you ever had to term out a planner. And I think it's hard to recruit for term planners. The other thing, and I know the priorities came out of the housing element, and that those were identified, and the league continues to believe that the highest priorities are funding, having a permanent, steady source of funding for affordable housing, that identification of city sites is crucial, and to see that on the unfunded or unscheduled list is really dismaying to me. I would like that to be on the 2025 list, because if we don't have these sites available for affordable housing, we're not going to build the housing we need through for-profit developers. We'll get a little bit, but we're not going to get the numbers that we need. And so we really need to identify significant sites. And then the other, aside from the adaptive reuse, which I do think should be high priority, is the local preference and finding a way to make as much of the housing that is built under this cycle available to people who live and work in this community. So that's my input. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. We're all friends here, so first name's fine. So thank you for your comments. I will close public comment. So I'll turn it back to my colleagues. We do have a recommendation that I think we should take a vote on, or at least a recommendation on the vote. But comments, Mr. Jordan, you want to start us off?
Sure, then I'll have to look back and find out how messed up my comments are according to the recommendation. Yes, Eli, so really by the time we get to whenever, March, April, May, and we're looking at a phone book, or we're looking at our computers at 5,000 pages. I think you really need to chat up the two talking points, one on the issue of staff, I would just call it cross-pollinating project to project, or reacting to legislation, or reacting to staff taking a break, or reacting to, you know, attrition that you didn't know was coming, or you knew it was coming, but you were ignoring, that type of thing, and the role it plays in meeting these goals. And so, you know, these years that are on here as the end date don't just start bleeding off, and it wasn't really hammered in terms of the ask, that ask is helping solve that from bleeding off into the future. And the other one is too, which, thank you, Eric, for thinking of that, that's the upfront at that time too, talking about the potential impacts on other departments. So we don't get to a point where, well, we upstaffed community development, but then we didn't do anything for city attorney or public works or something like that, which would totally be my usual nightmare silo type of event, right? And you're just going, okay, that made no sense, right? But so that's all being discussed homeopathically at the same time, multiple departments in front of us, or you're making them other departments sit up and say, okay, what does that look like to you? So they can talk about it in front of us, that kind of thing. You know, that land use inventory thing also, I'll do it for $1 less. Okay, you can walk around town, and I'll just pick on however many surface parking lots the city owns, you know, but you can literally walk around town and just see, you know, available land, and put that in a put those in a bucket somewhere and say, well, I know we're really going to do it more formal by the end of never, but can we have a short a bucket now that we know, and figure out, well, what do we need to do to incentivize or work on those sites, or get an owner involved, the city or some of the other clearly underdeveloped and decaying properties that are in particular around downtown. And then, of course, I'm sure you knew the one item I was talking about that was on the yellow list, and that's short-term vacation rentals. And so fortunately, you have all three people sitting here who are naked on this issue. Nobody else on the city council is sitting here naked on this issue. It's the three of us. And I'll say I'm the most naked because that's where most of the coastal zone is in my district. And I still cling to the belief that there's a big gain to be made there. I'll just use my neighborhood. When a house goes on the market in my neighborhood that was built in 1956, there's 150 people coming to look at it. And in that 150 people are hedge fund and REIT type of people. But there's also normal people with families that can afford to go chase that house. And frequently they're losing that battle to somebody who is, let's just say, abusing our situation right now, and being able to go put a short-term vacation rental in a single-family residence that could have gone to a group of single-family people. And we need to plug that hole. I mean, we're never going to get out of that hole unless we start to plug it, and to see it on that never assigned list is really frustrating. There are people out there that know we're sitting here naked and are abusing this just in the coastal zone. And so I will be constantly on you about that, how to get it off that last page and over onto one of the other friendlier color pages. And hopefully there's a way to do that that doesn't just mess up the way you prioritized our resources for these other pages. So, thank you.
Member Gutierrez?
Yeah, I'm fully supportive of the staff recommendation. I actually see that hourly ADU plan checker, that position being such key to helping other staff. So, I mean, I would even go as far as making that like a permanent full-time position. And the reason that I'm going to be just very transparent, I'm going to be a big advocate to when the budget hearing comes up, is that we have a housing crisis, and your team is it's very important. If we can get the proper staff to fulfill these programs. And you constantly hear community members saying, well, the city, and it takes too long, and the developers. So if we're able to staff, we're going to be able to help this housing crisis, especially for the ADUs. For me, ADUs are, it's what's going to save that workforce to stay here, the long-term residents to be able to stay in our community. And it also brings property taxes. When we're doing a great job in giving money to build, project for the housing authority, but they don't give the property taxes that we need. And those property taxes help the city function. And when you build ADUs in existing lots, it also helps the neighborhood. It provides, at least in my district, you'll prevent gentrification because you will help locals stay, the workforce to stay, and you also, with ADUs, those are the ones that the rents are not so high because, the property owner lives on that lot. So for me, it's really, really important to help this department, and I'm just going to be very transparent.
Great, thank you for your comments. This is a good discussion, especially again, in light of what took place at the Planning Commission today, and I hope that some of the planning commissioners will be able to come back and watch what we discussed today. So I'm supportive of the staff recommendation, and I'm going to try to word it a certain way so that we can get the touch on the other departments as well, because there are some unknowns on just what this fully would cost and where it would come from. So, but for everything that was said today, affordable housing is the priority. And within the department, there are also other challenges outside of housing, but just the work plan in general that the low levels of staffing are impacting. We don't know what other of the 1,001, or like there's over 2,001 state bills, and a lot of those this year, and a lot of those will be housing again, and we'll probably have to pull people off of them again, going back into, remember Jordan's 15-year matrix where they get pulled off and come back. So we really need to start thinking long-term, succession planning as well. And starting to rebuild the institutional knowledge that we would have, especially if we were able to get staff now in the first couple of years of the housing element that could be here for their careers. And as we go into the next cycle, which will be here before we know it, they will have gone through this and they will be much better prepared for the next cycle. So the earlier and the more experience we can get them will be helpful. So in terms of the recommendation, it's what I think we need to do is direct you to work with the city administrator on these priorities and provide council information on what it would take to implement this staffing along with other departments, what it would take, and have that information available to the council during the budget process so we can make evaluations on what the trade-offs would be and what potential funding sources are out there. So that would be the motion, is to work with the city administrator to continue to move these discussions forward for the budget.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you? Oh, me. I will move the motion that.
Okay, motion's been made by Member Gutierrez and second by Member Jordan. All in favor? Aye. Passes unanimously. And with that, anything else? We are done. Thank you, everyone.